Good afternoon. This is David Bernstein. I'm President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome to this edition of the CRCast, a bi-monthly webcast for Jewish advocacy and Jewish community relations professionals and lay leaders. We are very honored to have with us today Elan Carr, Special Envoy Elan Carr. Elan was appointed in February of 2019 by the Secretary of State, Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Anti-Semitism. He is a U.S. attorney, a prosecutor. He served his military service in Iraq. He was the international president of AE Pi fraternity. He also, in the interest of full disclosure, is an old friend and also a son of an Iraqi Jew. And we were just saying before this started that I'm sure both of our mothers could have written their version of the Babylonian Talmud on what is and is not anti-Semitism. So
that's probably right. And probably our mothers have different recipes for tabit and kubba as well.
Exactly, I'm sure they do. Mine's better. So really appreciate you spending time with our community relations field, Elan, and couldn't be more honored that you're with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for having me. And like you said, we've been old friends, and I'm a great admirer of your work and of all the wonderful things that JCPA does. So thank you, and yishar koach.
Absolutely. So I want to just start with asking you about your work. What is the Special Envoy office do? What is the mandate? What doesn't it do as well?
Well, we're tasked by law and by design. I mean, this is a statutory function with combating all anti-Semitism in the world globally, and that's a big challenge because anti-Semitism is currently on the rise. It's been rising for a few years now, and really we can say that we're engaging in this conversation at a time of real crisis. We see anti-Semitism coming from three disparate sources. You have the ethnic supremacists of the far right, the Israel-hating radical left, and militant Islam. And what's interesting about that is that these are three groups that should hate each other more than they hate anything else on earth, and yet find themselves united in their hatred of the Jewish people. And so when you see the confluence of these three dangerous and threatening forces together, it's a challenge, and we're fighting all of it. We don't rank them in importance. We say, look, it's Jew hatred is Jew hatred. I don't care what ideological clothing it wears. We're going to confront all of it. We're going to fight all of it because all of it is a threat to the Jewish people, and all of it, by the way, I would say the three groups are united by two things. One is their hatred of Jews. But the other thing, no less important, is the fundamental incompatibility of their ideology with everything on which the United States and all great countries in the world are based. Whether it's the ethnic supremacists, the radical left, or militant Islam, their ideology threaten America, not just the Jewish people, but threaten our countries. And so really this is a critical fight of our age. And I'm very proud to lead the administration's efforts to roll back this ancient human sickness.
Okay, so you've been on the job about 6 months now. You've traveled a fair amount. What have you seen so far? What has surprised you in this work?
Well, I should be optimistic here after raining on everyone's parade. The thing I think that surprised me most is a very good thing. And that is the extent to which a lot of foreign leaders, talking about non-Jews, leaders at all levels, from heads of state and government to ministers, parliamentarians, and local leaders, mayors, coordinators, is the extent to which so many of them genuinely appreciate that this is an urgent problem and a crisis that demands immediate attention. That really is what surprised and frankly delighted me in my travels overseas. These are leaders who understand that anti-Semitism threatens not only the Jewish people, but threatens them. President Trump calls it, every time he speaks about anti-Semitism, he calls it a vile poison. And that's what it is, because every society that has imbibed this poison in history has rotted to its core. Anti-Semitism really is history's greatest barometer of human suffering. And these leaders get it, and they're passionate, and they stand with eloquence, and they say, we have got to fight this because our children's future depends on it. What kind of countries, plural, will our kids inherit? What kind of continent? We're talking about Europe. And certainly in Europe, of all places, these leaders are appalled that 75 years after the crematoria stopped operating, we could have a resurgence of open, unvarnished anti-Semitism in Europe. And so I am actually quite optimistic, I have to say, by the number of partners we have. And you can always say, well, I wish there were more, but let me tell you, there are a lot, there are enough. And if there weren't, I'd be worried, but there are a great many. And part of it is the open realization that this is a problem. But I have to say, there's another thing too, and we can't underestimate this factor. It's the president's leadership. When you've got an administration that has made fighting anti-Semitism the priority that this president has made it, and that my boss, Secretary Pompeo, has made it. I mean, when the president in the State of the Union address spends a lot of time talking about how we have to root out this sickness and this vile poison, the world monitors that. And so they know when I go overseas, David, these leaders know that it's not just the envoy that cares about this. My boss and his boss really care about this. And you know what? That makes a difference because we are the United States. And when the president and the Secretary of State make it a priority, the world really pays attention.
Yeah, I actually want you to riff on that a bit. What leverage does the United States bring to the table that would make a European country or a non-European country, for that matter, want to fight anti-Semitism more seriously than it already does?
Enormous, enormous. Simply a public statement by them. Let me give you one example that is related to anti-Semitism, but actually slightly different. Let's talk about Holocaust issues. I made a trip to Poland. By the way, Poland, a country where great progress is being made. I mean, this government in Poland now is spending more money on refurbishing and repairing Jewish cemeteries than any previous government in Poland has. However, there's a far right in Poland that is despicable and openly anti-Semitic. They're not in government, but they're we could definitely say a threat to the Jewish people in Poland. When I got to Poland, there was a big debate over the statutory report that the State Department has to make to Congress on whether countries are complying with Holocaust restitution issues. Just the prospect, think about this, just the prospect of a report to Congress by the administration on this issue caused this was the topic of conversation in Poland. And so I ended up dealing with it, even though Holocaust restitution isn't directly my issue. I was happy to address it, and I did. And we talked about it. We had a press conference about it. But just the idea of the State Department reporting to Congress on what a country is doing is enough to create widespread concern about it. And so the United States has a lot of leverage, and thank goodness we have an administration that is determined to use that leverage to fight this relentless evil that is anti-Semitism.
Right. So we've seen a spike in anti-Semitism globally. We've seen a spike in this country as well. I note in France, for example, which is the second largest diaspora Jewish community, there are 500,000 Jews there. There have been 500 anti-Semitic incidents, and that violent assaults are up 270% in France. On what basis do you determine the countries to work in? Is it the number of anti-Semitic incidents? Is it the overall ideological environment? How do you think about this challenge in terms of where you choose to put your resources?
Right. So we look at what is going on in a given country, good and bad, because part of my role, it's not only to pummel the anti-Semites and pressure the recalcitrants, it's also to support with the full weight of the United States those friends and allies that are fighting this fight and doing the right thing. And like I said, we have many of those friends and partners, thank goodness. And so part of my role is to go to countries that are doing the right thing and fighting this. And so I make those decisions based on sort of the triage that we have to apply to this problem, which is a global problem. But one thing I wanted to tell you, David, is about what you said. The statistics in France, as bad as those statistics are about the dramatic increase in the number of assaults, it's actually much worse because what we're seeing consistently is underreporting of anti-Semitic incidences. There are a number of reasons for that. Part of it is the way police collect, in some countries, the way they collect hate crime data. Part of it is also is that the more regular, the more open anti-Semitism is, the more inured a population becomes to it. And so, an insult yelled in the United States would cause a Jew to be shocked, whereas in some places in the world, that's just ordinary course of business. And if there isn't an incident of severe violence, it's not even an issue, and it goes unreported. And so really there are a number of reasons for that, but underreporting is dramatic, so much so that when you have surveys that ask, and there was recently one done in Europe, ask Jewish communities in Europe, have you experienced an anti-Semitic incident in the last year? The numbers are, it's not even close to the reported incidents. It's dramatically higher. And so this is a real problem, and we've got to fight this, and we've got to fight it for the sake of the safety of the Jewish people. But we also, like I said, we have to fight it for the sake of the future of these communities and these countries that will be ruined by this sickness.
Mm. Who has been fighting it well? What countries have been doing a earnest, good job trying to reduce anti-Semitism?
Well, there are three categories. There are the countries that are doing a lot of things right, and that are seeing a dramatic, really safety, by and large safety of the Jewish communities. You can say that, for example, the Jewish community reported to me in Hungary and in Poland that they are completely safe. Although there are some troubling developments in these countries, and those are acknowledged, and we talked about that, and I certainly met with government officials about it, but the Jewish communities are safe. Another place, take the other side of Europe, where the Jewish community is safe is in the UK, with all of the problems that we're seeing in the UK today, and all of the angst that developments in the Labour Party is causing the Jewish community. The Jews in the UK are by and large safe. So category one is countries that protect their Jewish community. Denmark is a great example, a country that has put enormous effort and resources into guaranteeing the safety of its Jewish community. Then there are countries where the leaders have said good things, but the facts on the ground are highly problematic. France is a very good example. President Macron has been couldn't be better in his statements. He's been fantastic, and I'd like to publicly compliment him on that. But when I go to France, which I will be doing, God willing, in November, we're going to be talking about follow-through. And how do you translate genuine and impassioned statements by the head of state into facts on the ground? The fact of the matter is the Jewish community in France is not safe. And that's unacceptable. I think President Macron would acknowledge that that's unacceptable. So how do we translate his excellent words and intentions into follow through on the ground? Germany, the Jewish community in Germany was always sort of an exemplar of safety. Germans are particularly sensitive, right, to anti-Semitism for historical reasons. And yet we see now that even in Germany, Jews are being attacked. And we had a government official in Germany, for the best of intentions and reasons, by the way, say that Jews maybe shouldn't wear kippot in public, and he withdrew that because, again, you never want to cave into anti-Semitism, but he had good intentions to want to protect the Jewish people. But think about it, to have to say that is so troubling that even in Germany, Jews are in danger. So that's the kind of, we see this dispersed and spread out. Let's look at the Middle East. In the Middle East, you've got Arab countries where there are Jewish communities left. There aren't practically none. But the Jewish communities are relatively safe. But of course, the countries are sometimes focal points of anti-Semitic venom that's being propagated not only internally but exported externally as well. So we've got a number of categories of problems. We have to fix all of it and address all.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the State Department has adopted what's sometimes called the working definition on anti-Semitism. Can you describe what this is and how it informs and animates your work?
Yes, and in fact, one of my major asks when I go overseas on a diplomatic bilateral visit is that a country that hasn't yet that they should adopt this working definition of anti-Semitism. This is the so-called IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and it's really been a game changer because in setting forth a series of examples, some 10 to 15 examples of anti-Semitism, to sort of put meat on the bones of the definition, it includes very clearly anti-Zionism and Israel hatred, the denial of Jewish ethnicity, the denial of the right of the Jewish people to self-determination. And that really is what has made the IHRA definition such a game changer. It's not a penal statute. One can't be prosecuted under it. But what it does is it gives countries and communities the tools to be able to say, look, what you're saying, right, you proverbial you, is anti-Semitic by definition. And that by itself is very important, because sometimes people just aren't clear about what is and is not anti-Semitic and why something is and why something is not. And so the IHRA definition has really been a very important tool in this regard. And again, one of my chief diplomatic requests is that countries that haven't yet do in fact adopt the IHRA definition. The United States, as you've said accurately, has adopted the IHRA definition.
So I'm going to move on to a bit of a touchy question, as you might anticipate. The president made some remarks yesterday questioning whether Jews who vote for or asserting really, that Jews who vote for Democratic Party might be disloyal. And that has sort of sent some shockwaves in the Jewish community. And I'm wondering, and I know your wheelhouse is not the United States, it's globally, but how do these remarks and how do these kinds of controversies affect your work globally?
Well, first of all, we deal with a lot of issues in the United States as well. I spoke at the funeral of Lori Kay, Zichronah Livracha, in Poway. Of course, that was a domestic anti-Semitic incident. And that was at the request of the White House, and I was representing the president and the full administration in that speech. And in fact, one of the things I said in my eulogy of Lori is that this administration is at war with white supremacism. And the authorization for my saying that came from the very top. And so that is the administration's position. About the president's statements, look, the president in one of his roles is the leader of the Republican Party. And as the leader of the Republican Party, he has every right to make the case that the Republican Party is more supportive of Jewish interests than the Democratic Party is. Now, that's the case he's entitled to make as the leader of the Republican Party. I am in a nonpartisan governmental position. I'm a political appointee, but as a government official, I'm not, a partisan official. And so it's really not for me to say how people should vote and how votes would serve one or another interest. But what I will say is this: the president was responding to some pretty appalling statements that were made about the Jewish people and about the state of Israel. And I think it's very important to call out anti-Semitism when we see it. And when we have people of prominence saying things that are you mentioned the IHRA definition, when you say certain things that under the IHRA definition meet the definition of anti-Semitism, I think we have to call that out. I think we have to recognize that this is a real problem. I mean, I'll tell you, David, the most disturbing meeting I've had in the last 6 months I've been on this job, and that's saying a lot, because in my business, we have many disturbing meetings. The most disturbing meeting I've had was with a UK Labour MP who walked out of the Labour Party because she said, and by the way, not Jewish, she said, I won't sit at the same table with anti-Semites, left the Labour Party. I met with her. She said to me, this disaster we have in England all started on the campuses, and we did nothing because they were only students. And then it came into the Labour Party, and we did nothing because it was just the far left fringe. And now they won and we lost, and I no longer have a political party that I can call home. I'll tell you, my hair stood on that, David. And I think that's why when we hear anti-Semitism from the right, from the left, from militant Islam, it doesn't matter where it comes from. All of us have to stand together, Jews and non-Jews, Democrats, Republicans, right and left, shoulder to shoulder. And we have to say this is unacceptable. We are not going to stand for it. We're going to call it out. And there's people have no business speaking this way. And I think we've got to come together on this and not politicize the fight against anti-Semitism.
So last question, Elan. I really appreciate your time here. Our Jewish Community Relations Network has been at the forefront in fighting anti-Semitism for the last 75 years and building bridges with other communities and so forth. what do you think in this current environment our field needs to do to be effective in combating anti-Semitism, and how can we help you?
Thank you. That's such a wonderful question, David. And I thank you. And actually, you're asking, it speaks volumes about the kind of leadership you bring to the Jewish community. And I thank you for that. So what we're seeing is that the polarization in America today has very much affected the Jewish community as well. And it's so difficult for the Jewish community to come together on so many issues. And while there is no confusion about neo-Nazism and ethnic supremacism, that is clearly anti-Semitism. When it comes to the anti-Semitism of the so-called new anti-Semitism, which I would argue is not new at all, it's the same anti-Semitism repackaged, but this anti-Israel version of anti-Semitism, the hatred of Israel, the delegitimization of Zionism, the movement to boycott and therefore economically destroy the Jewish state, that about that, certain segments of the Jewish community are touchy. Well, I don't know. Listen, we've got to be fair in saying Jew hatred is Jew hatred, and whether it comes from the right or the left or militant Islam, we are not going to start to weaponize anti-Semitism. And so the most important thing that you and the JCPA and that all of your community leaders can do is be emissaries for Jewish unity. That to say, look, we can disagree on a lot of things. How we vote about tax policy and social policy, fine. But when it comes to Jewish survival, when it comes to the safety of our children, we can't disagree. There can be no disagreement on that. We've got to come together, one community, and say enough is enough. And whether it comes from the right, the left, or militant Islam, we're going to fight this together, and there's going to be no disagreement about it. Let me tell you, if that would happen, it would change the world. Look at the effect that Jewish unity had in the UK. When the Jewish community, and a community, by the way, not known for making waves, came together and said they had a rally entitled Enough is Enough. They had a joint, competing newspapers had a joint editorial, United We Stand, competing newspapers together to say we are drawing a line and we're going to fight this together. Now we have what you see as a civil war in the Labour Party. That wouldn't have happened without Jewish unity as a prerequisite for people to stand up and say, look, we can't tolerate this, right? We need that here. We need the Jewish community to come together. And who better to do that than JCPA, than an organization that exists to deal with public policy. So it's time for us, all of us, to come together and to say whatever our disagreements are on policy and politics and party, when it comes to this, we are, like it was said in Mount Sinai, Ish Echad Belev Echad, one person with one heart. That's what is said about the Jewish community, that when the Jewish community stood at the foot of Mount Sinai, that's the kind of unity we need today to once and for all fight this vile poison, as President Trump calls it, and ensure the kind of future, the kind of better, more decent, more just future that our children and grandchildren so richly deserve.
Elan, thank you. I really appreciate you spending the time with our field. We couldn't be more honored. We couldn't be more appreciative. We also really appreciate the ongoing dialogue and openness and your willingness to connect to our local communities. And we couldn't ask for more. So thank you very much. We wish you all the best in your work moving forward. You are doing our bidding as well, both as an envoy of the United States and also as an envoy of the Jewish people. So we couldn't be more appreciative of that. Thank you. And thank you all for joining in. Please stay tuned for our next CRCast, which you'll hear about shortly. Take care.
Thank you.